Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. So this video is going to be about the decline of the Liberal Party and the rise of the Labour Party in the United Kingdom over a century ago, because one of my viewers requested it. So it's a book which is best encapsulated in The Strange Death of Liberal England by George Dangerfield. Dangerfield is published in 1935, and I have read it donkey's years ago. So there were first of all the Liberals of Gladstone's era. We don't call them old Liberals, but they're not new Liberals. They came later. So they were free marketeers. They believed in capitalism, obviously. They weren't libertarians. They believed in laissez-faire, more or less. And they said there should be a law against blasphemy, for example, that homosexuality should be illegal, certain things which would be antithetical to liberalism today. But they believed in the small state, candle ends and cheese pairings, as Gladstone said. He'd been Chancellor of Exchequer as well as Prime Minister. So retrenchment, peace, retrenchment, reform. The Whig view of history gradually extending the franchise to more and more, bring them within the pale of the Constitution. But Gladstone had sometimes contradicted this, saying he was an out-and-out inegalitarian, believing that wealth, birth, status, any of these are at least important as any of the virtues. But he did contradict himself, saying, I was always back the masses against the classes. Notice how different the A is in those two nouns. So a bit of a contradiction in there. But anyway, Gladstone, he stood down as Prime Minister in 1894 and Lord Rosebery took over. But the new Liberals were ushered in at the dawn of the 20th century in response to the Conservatives who'd won their election victory in the khaki election of 1900 amidst the Second South African War. And the Liberal Party was almost riven between imperialists and Little Englanders. The Little Englanders weren't anti-imperialists in the modern sense, but they were just more critical of a governmental policy with regard to the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. Anyway, the new Liberals were thinking, well, why is it we've lost, and how can we win over the few working class voters that there are and men of the middle class? So L.T. Hobhouse and Lord Haldane were amongst the luminaries of new liberalism, saying we need to be more interventionist. We need to do something for the working man and bring in, for example, a progressive taxation that will charge you a higher percentage the richer you are, something Gladstone had been inimical to. And he thought that even income tax was an 18th century innovation which no one had quite got round to abolishing, since they're paying off the national debt. Now, the Labour Representation Committee started out as a section within Labour and later split off to be within the Liberals, so later split off to be a separate party. The Liberals being stronger in Northern England and Scotland, in Wales, in southwestern England, weaker in southern and eastern England, bigger in certain cities. So the Conservatives and their Liberal Unionist allies stronger in southern and eastern England. Anyway, 1905, A.J. Balfour resigned, and Edward VII appointed a new Prime Minister, that's to say Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, the leader of the Liberal Party, who quickly went to the country. 1906 election, the Liberals were elected handily. So the Liberals started doing things. Previously, the government should do as little as possible, but setting up labour exchanges, because previously looking for a job, you had to traipse from place to place seeking a job. It was all together, and that was linked to benefits. There was unemployment benefit, there was sickness benefit, it was really insurance. You had to pay in a bit. National insurance we got to this day. It was sort of a precursor of the welfare state. Free medical inspections for children in school, not the medical care itself, and free milk in schools and things like that. Churchill was a Liberal MP at the time, said he could see little glory in an empire which couldn't flush its own sewers and things like that, as in we should tackle the problems we have here at home. Trades unions were becoming quite prominent, had several million members, and some of them were going over to support Labour, a lot of them supported the Liberals, none of them supported the Conservatives, so far as I know, partly because of the Taff Vale judgment about the rail strike. So the Liberals, were they seeking to head off the growth of Labour, or was it perhaps they thought Labour, perhaps they were misguided in a way, and what they did actually advance Labour's cause, who was then able to overtake them? it's debatable. Maybe they didn't perceive Labour as a serious threat because Labour wasn't even a proper party till, say, the 1906 election, when they got 0.5% of the vote. So seemed to be negligible. Who would have guessed that within only 17 years they would overtake the Liberals as the second largest party? There were some double-seated constituencies, as in one constituency having roughly 140,000 people would elect 2 members of parliament, not 1. And so Labour and the Liberals often had a deal. Liberals will put forward 1 candidate and Labour put forward 1 candidate. The Conservatives will put forward 2 candidates, presumably, and quite likely at least the Liberal or the Labour guy will get elected, quite often both. But they're certainly going to make sure that the Conservatives are not going to get both. So it went like that, and that gave Labour a foot in the door. Maybe that was the Liberals sowing the seeds of their own destruction. Anyway, there are lots of strikes. People talk about the Edwardian crisis. So the Liberals were not satisfying a lot of the advanced working class. And the Liberals, they believed in things like temperance, not being against alcohol, against drunkenness, trying to reduce alcohol consumption, placing some restrictions on the consumption of strong waters, disestablishment of the church in Wales, the nonconformist conscience animated the end to indentured workers, labourers contracts in South Africa and elsewhere, the so-called Chinese slavery issue, which I know Churchill said was an example of a terminological inexactitude. Home rule for Ireland, though they weren't really pushing that one till after the 19 election. Free trade, and the Conservatives wanted tariff reform. The big loaf, the small loaf, which would you rather pay for the same price? Dear food for the millions, cheap labour for the millionaire. That's what Churchill said a Tory government would usher in. But anyway, so then after the 2 elections of 1910, the Liberals were in a much weaker position because they no longer had a majority, had to rely on cooperation from Labour and or the Home Rule Party. There are Irish MPs, not all Irish MPs, but about 3/4. So the issue of Home Rules comes to the fore, which have been buried, scarcely mentioned in the elections of 1910. And then there are the suffragettes causing a headache or disrupting their meetings and so on. And most of the Liberals are against granting the vote to women, so they might grant the vote to some women. But the trouble is, then it'll be older or wealthier women, as in more likely to vote Conservative, and they don't have a coherent policy. Surprisingly, the Conservatives are actually a bit more amenable to female suffrage, and Labour is as well. But that's not surprising in the case of Labour. So then there comes the First World War, and that really sounded the death knell of liberalism. Defence of the Realms Act passed almost immediately, DORA as it's known. So that's really the antithesis of liberalism, is sweeping powers granted to the government, just overweening state intervention, censorship of the press, not allowed to own binoculars and not allowed to feed animals, and no treating in pubs, buying drinks for someone else, even their own spouse, reducing pub drinking hours, higher taxes on drinking. So state control, they become very authoritarian. You're not allowed to emigrate, and on and on. And they sequester property and things like that, and eventually conscription. So in order to win the war, they have to take over lots of the economy and harness industrial power to the war effort. So that was really liberalism committing suicide in a way. If they'd stayed out of the First World War, it might have been very different. And then Marxism came to the fore. Obviously, Marxism has been around in some form since 1848, but was making serious inroads. And the Labour Party was there. And at this stage, in the 19-teens, into the 1920s, there wasn't a clear distinction between parliamentary socialism, which is what the Labour Party's been since, and revolutionary communism. And some Labour people openly admiring Lenin and being Marxists. I mean, there have always been a few Marxists in Labour. Even today, there are a handful. But it was a significant chunk. Maybe it was even half the Labour Party thought that Marxism was the way forward. So then, obviously, H.H. Asquith was the Prime Minister. His son Raymond was killed in the war. Asquith hit the bottle in a major way. And there was the shells crisis. All these faulty shells were produced. And David Lloyd George managed a parliamentary coup. Some of the cabinet willing to say that they had no confidence in Asquith and about a third of the Liberal Party, and so therefore Asquith lost his majority, and Lloyd George, in a backstairs deal, had already stitched it up with the Conservatives. The Conservatives were willing to support a motion of no confidence to bring Asquith down, and Lloyd George become Prime Minister. In the end, they didn't have to do that. Asquith bowed out to the inevitable, but he remained leader of the Liberal Party. Lloyd George was not leader of the Liberal Party or of any party, but he was still Prime Minister because he could command the support of the House of Commons. The Conservative Party, ever pragmatic with an appetite for power, as one history title put it, willing to serve under him, who'd been a hate figure for them in 1902 over the fighting in South Africa, or over the People's Budget in 1909 when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. So then came 1918, the election, and obviously the Conservatives win that. The Liberals much reduced. There's the coupon for the coalition. The coupon election, Asquith contemptuously says, is a coupon to show whether you support this coalition as either a Liberal or Conservative. But the Liberals lose greatly because they're at each other's throats. There's that minority faction still backs Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, who remains Prime Minister until 1922. In October that year, partly because of the Chanak crisis, backing down in face of the Turks, backbench Conservative MPs say, we have no confidence in him, and he's forced out. Obviously, the Conservatives get their own man in as Prime Minister, very briefly, Bonner Law, and there's an election. And that election, of course, is the one where Labour overtakes the Liberals, becomes the second biggest party, and the Liberals have never come back. 98 years later, there's very little sign of it. They've got 11 members of Parliament to Labour's, I can't even remember how much it is, 210 or something. Which I know is a dismal result, but far above the Liberal Democrats. The Liberal Democrats being the heirs of the Liberals is a bit more complicated than that because they're factions from this party going to that one and back. And so the actual line of succession, or what is a family tree, is not that clear-cut. So part of the problems of the Liberals in the 1920s, they didn't represent a social class. Labour said we're for the working class. The Conservatives will say they're for everyone, but most will say, come on, really they're for the upper class and to some extent the middle class. Now the upper class is tiny, 1% of the population. The middle class was 30% of the population at most, not all of whom vote Conservative. But the Conservatives obviously had working class voters. About a third of the working class voted Conservative. If it wasn't for that, the Conservatives would have lost. They desperately needed some working class support, and they got it. And then obviously the poorest people tend not to vote at all. Okay, but most of the working class voted Labour, a bit of them voted Liberal, a few of them voted middle class, voted Liberal. And the Liberals, their support was not geographically concentrated, so it was too diffuse. They would be, if they're getting 10% of the vote, but 2% of the representation, something like that. So very underrepresented. It could be the other way around, so long as your votes were efficiently distributed. Anyway, so they were seen as being too effete, too intellectual, too het up with abstruse constitutional issues, reform and things like that, and proportional representation so tedious, so slow, not a bread and butter issue. They're not working class or middle class, and they're not for industry and mining or something like that, or for farming and banking. They're not for a section of the economy, and they seem to have failed in the First World War. They've done anything which is very opposite to liberalism. They're totalitarian ideologies. There's communism, there's fascism, and you've got to be tough. You can't be vacillating and saying, oh, we care about civil liberties, we can't take firm action. Labour, they're willing to do it, to take decisive action, as they would see it, to emancipate the working class, to tackle poverty. Conservatives willing to take decisive action for national security, whatever else they care about. But they still made the intellectual running in things. Some things like John Maynard Keynes, his book "We Can Conquer Unemployment" in 1929, because of the slump for all those years, unemployment obstinately high after the First World War. So Lloyd George had stood down as PM. Asquith still leader of the party till 1926. Lloyd George finally becomes leader of the party, but they're also split. They're highly fissile with Simonite Liberals and Samuelite Liberals, and then obviously the Simonite Liberals, Sir John Simon's lot, supporting the Conservatives in the national government and eventually merging into them, National Liberals. Conservatives had absorbed the Liberal Unionists by the time of the First World War. So there was a strange death of liberal England, but George Dangerfield's looking back to the Edwardian period. It's 20 years since I read his book, saying they didn't deal with suffrage, they didn't deal with the demand for home rule or the conservative backlash willing to support the Ulster volunteer force. They didn't know what to do. They couldn't cope with these. They didn't resolve the issues decisively, and all these strikes. So their government was palsied, was just indecisive, and didn't achieve results in these things. Unemployment was fairly low. There's fairly good economic growth, but their welfare program they couldn't afford because of building these castles of steel, the Anglo-German naval race. And then there was we've had the strange death of Labour Scotland by Jerry Hassan since, or the strange death of Tory England was written in 1905 after the Conservatives lost the third election on the trot. Although that election, the Conservatives actually got more votes in England than Labour in England, not the United Kingdom, 2005. But we've had the even stranger rebirth of Tory Scotland in, when was it, about 2000 and I can't remember. 2014 was 2015 I think, or was it 2017, when the Conservatives won lots of seats, because remember the Conservative Party was wiped out in Scotland in 97, got none in 2001, got one in 2005. Anyway, that's just a very brief history of why Labour overtook the Liberals, mostly the Liberals' failings. I haven't talked about Labour's virtues and accomplishments yet. Toodaloo.